Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erin O'Mara. I am the president of The Nation. I hear you guys have been having a really extraordinary conference, and that's great news. I hope that everybody's getting a lot out of it. I am thrilled to be here today to facilitate a conversation and introduce Melissa Harris Perry. Melissa is a Nation columnist. She is the Presidential Endowed Chair of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University, where she was the founding director of the Anna Julia Cooper Center on Gender, Race, and Politics in the South. She's the author of the award-winning Barbershop Bibles and BET, Everyday Talk and Black Political Thought, and Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America. Harris Perry received her BA degree in English from Wake Forest University and her PhD in political science from Duke. She also studied theology at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. Harris Perry previously served on the faculty of the University of Chicago, Princeton University, and Tulane. We're really excited also that we are partnering with Melissa on a new podcast project. And we hope to have lots of information on that soon, and we hope you all will tune in. And without further ado, here is Melissa Harris Perry.
Erin, thank you so much. I appreciate the lovely introduction, and I am really excited to have a chance to talk to the conference. So I've actually been lurking in the conference and hanging out as a participant for a lot of the day. I know that you all heard from my friend, my colleague, the extraordinary Professor Sherry Williams, who was a member of the panel earlier this morning. She and I did a fantastic project with the Nation 2 years ago titled Black on Campus. And then, of course, her just absolutely fantastic student reporting project, Vision 2020. I have been writing with the Nation. The Nation is home in a million different ways, but I've been writing with the Nation since before Barack Obama was a president, and in fact, thought a great deal, Erin, about the Nation this past weekend because my husband James and I celebrated our 10th anniversary on Saturday. And we, of course, got married on a Nation cruise. So that is how much the Nation is our family. So here's what I want to do, you all. I am such the school teacher that I really can't help myself. And I know for all of you who are in, digital classes and distance learning right now, you've probably seen the last Zoom slide presentation you ever want to see, but it's just how I think. So the way we're going to start this is I'm going to start with a bunch of slides that I'm going to go through pretty quickly. And I want to do that just so that we have some basis of shared knowledge and information. Then we'll open it up for discussion. And please know that you can ask me about anything in the slides, but also feel free to go way beyond the bounds of the presentation and to ask me about anything that you think might be useful that I might know about or be able to direct you to as emerging storytellers and journalists. So we're going to start, and I've titled this talk, The Aims and Remains of Journalism. And it, in fact, comes from my very first gig as a professor at the University of Chicago. For those of you who may know the University of Chicago, first-year undergraduate students each year receive a lecture, The Aims of Education. And then in the weekend of their graduation, of their commencement, they receive a second lecture called The Remains of Education. And it's always someone different and fabulous. And I saw a lot of aims and remains of education speeches over the years, and really came to think a lot about how we can frame all of our endeavors in that way, sort of in our initiating starting points, what it is we aspire to, what we hope for, and then at some point sort of stopping and assessing and asking what here remains. So because I can't get you to raise your hands and I'm not in the room with you, I'm going to get you to do a little digital exercise. On the very next slide, here's all I want you all to do. I just want you to drop into the chat, just populate it with a 3 to 5 word sentence. It can go longer than that. I just mean don't write a paragraph, but a few words about what you see as the aims of journalism. What are the goals? What at its most aspirational? What is it that journalists are supposed to be up to. What is the business of journalism? What are our goals? And so I just want you all to start populating that. And while you do, I'm going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to come back to those things that you're populating in the chat as we go forward. Okay, so let me just suggest one way or one set of things, and I am massively simplifying this, but it's just so that we can walk through some diagnostic or assessment. So if we were to think about some of the ways we could frame the aims of journalism, I've suggested here that it is in part to investigate the actions of government officials and private entities, also to inform the public of these actions, to interpret meaning of these actions, to encourage and host robust debate of ideas among the public, and also to allow the public to hold the powerful accountable. So on this next slide, the image that you'll see here is Ida B. Wells. And in so many ways, Ida B. Wells is the model of journalism from my perspective. She is indicative of someone who uses social science, evidence, reason, but also at all points has a very clear, strong standpoint around issues of justice. And what I'm hoping that if we were to accept that these are key aims of journalism, that the goals are investigative, informational, also interpretive, right? So interpretive is a little different than opinion writing, right? It's interpretive of our data, interpretive of our findings. And that our goal isn't to simply inform because journalists know best and will tell the public, but rather through our information, through our investigations, through our interpretation of meaning, that our goal will be to, in fact, encourage, right, this robust debate of ideas, that we want to make the marketplace of ideas stronger. And then to allow the public to hold the powerful accountable, so that the role of journalism is not simply from the top to the bottom, but also to help move the bottom in its capacity, right? The public in its capacity to hold the powerful accountable. So I see you guys are starting to drop into the chat. I love this, informing people to make their own decisions. Oh, I see. I like Arthur's here, holding the wealthy and powerful accountable. We've got to reveal the truth. We can play with these ideas of truth a little bit. So now I'm going to ask you on the very next slide. So even as you continue to give me aims of education, the next slide is going to ask for one more thing for you to keep putting in there. And that is to, whatever your aims are, whatever you've thought of as the goals, also start dropping in any media sources or any individual journalists that are meeting these primary aims of journalism. And they don't have to be perfect. Let me be very clear. They don't have to be perfect in meeting all of these aims. But is there anybody you think is getting it right? And I want to start there because I'm going to talk a lot about what I think we're getting wrong, but I at least want to give us an opportunity to engage with the possibility that even when systems are broken, there's often still a lot of good that is happening within them. So make sure that journalism is the first draft of history. Lovely, Jared. I like that. Okay, so two things are happening in the chat. We're thinking about what the aims of journalism are, and we are lifting up the names of either journalists or media sources that we think are meeting these primary aims. Now, here's, if you want to kind of think like the social scientists, what would be the necessary conditions in order to make these aims of journalism possible? How does that even become possible for journalists to do these lofty democratic goals? So I'm just going to suggest a few here, and I'm only going to end up diving into one. But the idea that journalists need resources in order to report. Journalism is not free. Freedom is not free. They will need the freedom to report, right? Some level of capacity to not be afraid for their lives and their livelihood. They will need, in fact, the capacity, the ability to reflect and to interpret. and then they will need the resources to communicate their findings, right? So they have to find it, they have to be free to find it, they have to be able to reflect and interpret on it, and then they've got to be able to communicate what they find. And you'll see to the right some images there that I just want to remind us that these are not necessary preconditions that are met either at all times in the US or in many times in much of the rest of the world. In fact, you may not be watching the news today, but if you watch or tune in or listen or scroll through news a bit later today, you will see that we're in the midst of a conversation about a journalist writing for the Jewish Observer, I think, who was just attacked while trying to report about COVID-19. So, and we of course have a president who has talked about and framed the press and media as, Francesca's story a few seconds ago on Vox. Yes, lovely. That's from the Nation admin. Okay, great. All right. Yes, the Committee to Protect Journalists. So all of these things are literally happening in this moment. All right. What also are the necessary conditions for the public? So it's not only the journalists have to have resources and the ability to interpret, if we go to the next slide, it's also that the public must have access to reporting. They must have trust of the reporting. They must have the ability to understand reporting. They must have the capacity to interpret and adjudicate it. And they have to have the ability to transform that information into strategies for accountability, right? So if they get the reporting, if they trust it, if they understand it and interpret it, but they can't do anything about it for accountability, then ultimately we can't meet all of those aims. And so what I want to ask is, how are we doing? If those are the aims and the necessary preconditions, then how are we doing? So I'm going to pick just one under each. So the one that I want to choose for the preconditions for journalists on the next slide is resources. And I'm going to go through these slides very quickly, just so that you can see something about our current resources. So what you'll see is that newsroom employment in the US declined by almost a quarter in that decade between 2008 and 2019. And so this is not exclusively journalists. This is all employees in newsrooms, but newsrooms have been shrinking. And in fact, of course, we know local news, especially newspapers, have been shuttering across this decade as well as in the decade prior to this. So this is not a reduction that happens in the context of a very robust media. This is a set of newsrooms that were already in decline and then continue to decline. On the next slide, you'll see that the number of newsroom employees at U.S. newspapers, right? So if we look at simply print media, right, declined by nearly a half in that decade between 2008 and 2018. Newspaper publishers, that number decreases substantially. Now, what you'll notice if you pop your eyes down a little bit is that broadcast television stays largely flat and fairly elevated. Radio broadcasting is fairly flat. And the one place where there is some growth is around digital native, right? So in other words, things that are that begin as digital endeavors. There has been some growth there, but that growth does not offset that decline that we've seen with newspapers. All right, on the next slide, I'm so sorry to show you this slide, but I feel like I have to, for newsroom employees with any level of education, but much more importantly, for those of you all who are college students, if you look down to that second one, employees with at least a college degree, you'll see that all U.S. workers have an elevated median earning as compared with newsroom employees. So journalism is not the profession, at least in a median way, that is primarily about getting rich. And boy, we can talk about that here at the Nation. All right, If you pop down one more, you'll see this is in part related to the fact that wages in newsrooms have been pretty flat. And again, this is across that period from 2012 to 2018, and that's everybody in the newsroom. It's not as though the editors are getting rich. So, for example, if you look at these numbers in my other industry, which is higher ed, you will see that faculty salaries are quite flat, but administrator salaries have popped way up in those years. But that's not what's really happening with newspapers. They're staying flat for everybody. And then the very last slide I just want to show you here on this one question of resources is about the growing income gap between PR specialists and reporters. So for everybody who's getting their degree in communications, it is as a remunerative matter. It is more it makes more sense for your personal economic situation or fiscal situation to make the choice to be a PR person, to put your communication skills into the role of PR, which is very much not the same aims as journalism. All right, so I'm going to pause there for a second and just remind us there is some mostly bad news. There's a great deal of complex news in those data. I'm going to just blow through them because I just wanted you all to have them so we could then talk about them. But my primary goal to suggest to you there is that we may have very lofty goals of journalism. We may desire journalists and media to do a lot of work within the context of our democracy. But in our most recent decades, we have not made substantial investments in that field, in that area, in that space, right, in order to bring about those lofty democratic outcomes. Doesn't mean that all is lost, not at all. But I wanted to show you just on the resource front. All right, now let's pop in and we'll do last set of slides and then I'm done here. We'll go to trust. Now, again, remember there are preconditions both for journalists and there are preconditions for the public. What does the public need in order to be able to do and achieve those aims of journalism? And so I just, again, want to look at just one here, and that is trust. So you can see a time series decline here, and this is Gallup data. So this is just a time series decline in how much, in general, Americans trust mass media. And this question asks newspapers, TV, and radio all together. And so you'll just see that sort of long trend decline. If you were to go farther back in time, it's a more steep decline. But since 1997, which is, I know, the beginning of time for many college students, but it's still a fairly recent era until this moment. And I also want to point out that this time series ends in 2016. And that's important for a couple of reasons. But I just want you to see that decline that comes down to at the point at which we're electing President Trump, that we're down to about a third of Americans saying that they have substantial trust. Now, if you go to the next slide, we'll get to see a little bit what happens along that same slide down, right? But then this slide is dividing up for you Democrats and Republicans, and then showing you something kind of quirky that happens in 2016. So what you'll see is, again, the overall trend line for both partisan identifications is a shift down, right, towards less confidence in the press. But, and there's a couple of other times this happens, most importantly, actually, right around the 9/11 and Iraq war moment. You see there's a divide between, I wish I could show you on my, on the slides here, but right. So if you look at 2001, 2, 3, 4, you'll see Democrats go up in their confidence in the press while Republicans go down. So that's basically the Bush era. And then again, everybody's sort of declining for a bit. And then 2016, you'll see Republicans begin to slide down to the lowest numbers that we've seen among sort of a broad American group like this, while Democrats end up actually sort of reinvesting in their belief in press. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that, again, the Trump victory leads to this reinvestment trust in liberal media, and that certainly should be in quotes, right? But this idea that even as they're sort of moving towards one direction or the other, that you'll see what happens again on the right, for Republicans, is that media trust right, hits a low of below a quarter, right? So way down there in terms of belief in media. And on the very next slide, I'll show you this. This is happening, and I think it kind of sticks in my craw a little bit. Although when asked about media, if there is trust or lack of trust, overall, that big partisan divide is still related to the news source. So Fox News is the most distrusted among all U.S. adults, but that it looks really different if you take Democrats and those who claim to lean Democrat versus Republicans and those who lean Republican. Democrats and even the leaners, strong majority, 61%, strong distrust of Fox News, and as you might expect, of Limbaugh, of Hannity, and of Breitbart. But Republicans distrusting at that same level CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, NBC, Washington Post, CBS, ABC, those that we tend to think of as these legacy institutions. All right. I think I will do this. Oh, sorry. And over on the right there, I just want you to see this because on that same slide, I think it's important that that despite the fact that there is this massive distrust, that nonetheless viewership for cable TV news and profits for cable TV news move up in this time. So again, both of these, so despite the partisan distrust, there is a business incentive, and I think this is really important for the conversation we'll have. It's a strong business incentive, not necessarily to be trustworthy, but to be importantly attached to a particular ideological position. So the relative flatness, you end up with an increase in the combined annual profits for Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, whereas those that are thought of as not particularly ideological, remain flat throughout that time. And again, primetime viewers boost up. I think I'll end there. I have a lot of really fun, petty slides at the end. And if we want to get into cable news and the question of trust, I'm really excited to use my petty slides, but we won't use them yet. We'll have Dan on sitting by to do that. So there you go. I've given you all the words. Now let's have a conversation. Erin?
Let me unmute. Here I am. We have some great questions in the queue, and so let's get to them. Chloe Oldham asks, do you think it's more realistic to expect supply side, regulating social media platforms as news platforms and subsidizing the media, or demand side solutions, which are increasing media literacy, education, community engagement, which is more critical to the news crisis in the next few years?
Yeah, so I think that there is a level of supply side regulation that is necessary. It cannot be completely open, We have to have some level of regulation, in part because you cannot expect, part of the role of journalism itself, and of media itself is to inform, to provide the public with the ability to make those consumption choices. And if there is an incentive baked in to media itself not to provide that information about itself, and this is the push-pull when. So remember, if our aim of journalism is to report about big industry, when journalism is big industry, it cannot report on itself, So I think there is some level of supply side that is necessary, but I want to be clear, that's still a demand side, because that's going to come from the people, demanding that elected leaders require legislatively rules around how social media platforms operate. But as important as those sort of broad constraints are, I don't believe those broad constraints ever remain more than broad constraints when you're talking about profit-motivated business. So this is not about evil dudes sitting around deciding how to ruin democracy. That might happen on occasion, but the issue is that once the incentives are baked in for profit, then the systems, will always, money is like water. It finds a way over the rocks and through the cracks. So you have to set the big limits, but you also have to acknowledge that ultimately demand side is what is the, it's this language that the greatest term limit is the next election, that ultimately it is sort of that democratic work. But I do want to be clear, that does not mean that we can't, and in fact we must set those regulations. And for example, the net neutrality fight, which was very poorly named as a fight, because nobody cares about net neutrality when you call it that. But if you tell people what it actually is, everyone cares about it. So the net neutrality fight is a really good example of how you can't expect to hold accountable these efforts unless you have access to being able to hold it accountable.
Thank you. Sadie Bogred has a really good follow-up to that. She says, I recently heard a presentation on journalism as a luxury that led me to consider how journalism often fails to meet the information needs of communities in need and instead is directed toward those with more resources. Do you see this as a serious problem? And if so, how do you think newsrooms can try to remedy this while also acknowledging the economic realities they face?
Yeah, so yes, I see this as a big problem. And trying to think of how to frame this. I think the idea that we have to acknowledge the economic realities is part of a framework that is very contemporary. So the nature of American media right now, its profit motivation, its deregulation, and its echo chamber nature is not true of all American journalism at all times. Now, I'm a Black Southerner, so I don't really do nostalgia. Like, there's no time in America where you're going to get me to have like sepia-toned desire to go back to some previous era. Never. Like, I'm never going to feel that way as a Black Southerner. But what I will say is that there are very particular points in the American story around journalism that we can point to around modern journalism that deconstruct and shift the incentives of mainstream national press and hollow out the capacity of local press and of sort of counter-public press. So there has always been fake news. Fake news is real, right? There's always been fake news or simply enormous silences in news. So the key example that I might give as a Black Southerner is that most national press never reported on lynching, just never reported on it. Or when they reported on it, they simply reported on it falsely, right? They would call people criminals or rapists when in fact none of that was true. The antidote, the effort, was journalism that was not focused primarily on any given economic incentive, but instead was motivated by a justice incentive and was also motivated by a different audience. So I'm not always angry about a sub-audience. Black press writing to Black audiences is what brings about the justice associated with reporting finally on lynching. But that is quite different than saying, well, we have to fill 24 hours of, cable news, and we're in the midst of a pandemic, but we will spend like an extraordinary portion of that time, of those 24 hours, doing repetitive stories that are actually not about the pandemic at all, and don't forefront scientific knowledge and don't forefront even human stories, but actually simply pundit analysis that happens primarily because it is beneficial for those economic realities. So honestly, I have to say, for me, it's not about what newsrooms can do. It is, again, the demand and supply. It is about consumers making some choices about turning some things off and tuning into other things. I actually think the growth of podcasts is indicative of the hunger and thirst for alternate media sources, but we also have to turn off the old ones in order to get those new ones funded. And then the second thing I will say is that we have to shift the incentive structure, because right now the incentive structure simply will warp even the best journalists and efforts towards a motivation of quarter hours and profits and circulations.
Thank you. Mazana Borboom asks or points out that you've laid out the grim realities for newspapers in the United States. And the question is, what changes do you think we have to make to save local newspapers from becoming obsolete? And I would add on to that, magazines.
Yeah, magazines are tough. Like in fact, magazines are, those data are pretty tough. And working for a couple of different magazines right now. Okay, my dog. Including like legacy women's magazines that at least used to be able to, sell on advertising, right, for certain kinds of brands. It's a very fascinating moment and terrifying. So let me say, I don't have all the answers. Boy, if I did, I don't know. Maybe I'd have some warped incentives that I'd go into consulting and tell everyone how to fix this. What I do know is that we probably should not resist the realities of shifting ways that information will be received. So, what is relevant to me is not that it is physical, right? That you can hold it, that it's paper. What is key for me about a local paper isn't that it arrives on my doorstep, but that it is sourced by reporters who are embedded in community, right? And who are paid a living wage to do just that, right? To exclusively do that and not to have to, right, work 3 other jobs and then maybe, pick up a local story here and there. Now, earlier, you all were having a bit of a conversation about college newspapers and the ways in which university newspapers in some places have actually ended up operating as the local newspaper. So I keep thinking about Arizona and the big stories that the student journalists there broke. And there's a few other places where actually the student newspapers have been able to do this. And I will point out that conservative student newspapers are some of the best funded student organizations on campuses and are getting enormous influxes of money from conservative organizations to report on faculty, to report on administrations, and to report on local decision makers. So part of it is going to be about an investment in, both an investment in and a requirement from universities who are land users, who are employers, who are massive institutions with often a very big footprint in their localities, to provide that public service to cities and communities that don't have them. So universities ought to be not just teaching podcast classes. They ought to actually staff and source a local public radio station. Universities should not only support journalism professors and researchers for their school papers, but they probably ought to serve it with the space and salaries for professional reporters, but providing that space on a wide variety of college campuses. And I say that in part because I'm sitting in a college space, so I often think of the ways that colleges are predatory towards their communities without giving back, but also because I believe that there's a way in which that particular skill set of journalists sits very well with the particular sets of skills that are universities. So I actually think that there should be some fairly serious pressure applied to universities to provide that space in a local way.
Thank you. My colleague, Peter Rothberg, sent me a note that we could go over if we have about 1 more minute, because we're already over.
We're already over a little.
Extraordinary, and there's so many good questions. And I'm going to end on a question that really could be the subject of a seminar on its own, but I'm going to ask you to answer it in about a minute. Francesca Story is pointing out, is asking about trust in journalism and trust in the news, and wonders if some of the types of news that seem to be clickbait, which are negative and gloomy, are decreasing readers' trust. And to tag on to that, what could be done to build trust back?
So I know we only have 32 seconds, but Dan, can I use some of my petty slides real quick? Because I actually think they are responsive. Great. So Dan, if we can go to the slides that start with the 2016 reminder. So let me respond to this in a particular way. So I want to respond to the lack of trust in journalism the way that I would respond to the question of the lack of trust in the medical system held, for example, by African Americans. And often there's a lot of hand wringing. Oh no, how do we get African Americans to trust us enough to be in clinical trials? And for me, the answer is always, well, that distrust is well earned. People distrust you because they ought to. And so I just want to remind us what happens in 2016. So in 2016, you get this hand-wringing immediately after the election, where all of these folks are saying, oh no, we missed it. And I just want to say, as a political scientist, it was a very predictable election. I predicted it. Many other people predicted it. You didn't have to look at polls. There were a lot of things that you could know about the big general ways in which elections tend to go. And so the idea that everyone was wrong in U.S. media I'm skeptical of it. It either means that they were simply too stupid to call a very callable election, or they were too unethical because there was some benefit. And I want to go specifically to this idea. So rather than saying, oh, we were all wrong, how do we get it right? On the next slide, I'll say, no, actually, particularly for cable news, they were exactly right. And now let me explain what I mean by that, the very next slide. So what the 2016 election cycle does is make a ton of money and bring a ton of new viewers to cable news. So I was in cable news at this time, and what I can tell you is that viewership was dropping off pretty precipitously, and everyone was terrified about a Clinton v. Jeb Bush election. Everyone was sort of describing it as though this is going to be such a boring election, and Trump was ratings. So it got to a point where even when there were other Republican candidates who were giving substantive speeches, now you may not agree with them, but they were substantive, rather than taking, for example, Marco Rubio or John Kasich saying actual words, we were told to take an empty podium and just put underneath breaking news, Trump to speak. And I want you to think about that for a second. Breaking news, Trump to speak. And then I want you to think about the next 4 years of your life, which really have been consistently breaking news, Trump to speak. And not just that, if we go to the next slide, I want to point out that MSNBC in particular did something that for me is what news organizations, and particularly televised news organizations, do. So they frame. So just before the election gets sort of completely heated, MSNBC hires Brian Williams and sits him next to Rachel Maddow. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to show you what this looks like visually. So Rachel, for whatever else she is, good, bad, or otherwise, is brilliant. She is a brilliant, brilliant woman. She has a PhD. She's very accomplished. She's very erudite. And Brian Williams is an actual certified liar who had to, it's one thing we have in journalism is that we tell the truth. We know that he lied. We know that he lied repeatedly to this employer. We also know that his education is not at the same par that Rachel Maddow's is. So I'd like to say we put a dumb lying man next to a brilliant woman. Again, I'd like to say we put a dumb lying man next to a brilliant woman. Can we see the next slide? Right. So I want to suggest that part of what happens is when media frames something as possible, a dumb lying man next to a brilliant woman, or also maybe a sex offending dumb lying man next to a brilliant woman, that it actually creates not only in its words and its reporting, but also in its framing. All right. So we can come out of my petty slides there. But I show you that to make a point. If you all were paying attention, and I'm sure you were in the last section that you all just did with that beautiful piece on the erosion on Lake Michigan and the shoreline, and that compelling story, right, of a woman about to lose her family home, literally like it's about to fall off the cliff, right? And so that story, that framing, is standing in for a framing around climate change and the ways that all of us are literally about to fall off a cliff, that we can see it, there it is, right? And it's coming for us. So that story is both about that woman, but not just about that woman, and not just about her, but also framing for us visually and giving us a way of contextualizing and understanding. So in 2016, media, particularly televised cable news media, lied to Americans and also framed something that lied or were just too dumb to know it, right? Didn't look for enough alternate sources and made a circumstance that made President Trump possible. And then have spent the next 4 years, right, cultivating that relationship. And again, go back to those numbers I showed you before. As a result, profits tick up. As a result, viewership ticks up, because really, who would have tuned in to see the Secretary of Education nomination and confirmation hearings for Hillary Clinton's education secretary? Nobody wanted to see that, but we all watch Betsy DeVos like this, right? So the horror becomes a thing that you can cultivate and produce. So we cannot ask anyone to trust us. And in fact, I'd like us to be a lot more skeptical. if we want to be trusted, we must behave in trustworthy ways. Now, I don't believe that anyone at MSNBC is an evil, like, we'll get Trump elected. What I do think is that they ignored a whole bunch of other rules of journalism in order to pursue something that allowed for the clickbait, and that the effects of that are very real, not because a Republican won. Republican's going to win half the time, Democrat half the time, but because someone won, was given legitimacy, was allowed to be on stage with, was set in the framework with, and in a space that was actually illegitimate and irresponsible. And from the beginning, it should have been said, not 4 years into the administration. So I think we can't even begin to talk about rebuilding the trust of the public until we begin to first, on the supply side, talk about substantially and seriously holding accountable our journalist colleagues to behave in ways that are much more in line with the public interest.
Thank you. I want to turn this over to Peter Rothberg for his closing remarks. But before I do that, Melissa, I just want to say thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and you are extraordinary. I want to thank all of the attendees. I hope this has really been a really valuable day for you. And before I turn it to Peter, I want to thank Peter, and I want to thank Sarah Burke and Guia Del Prado and Sarah Baig. This is our first virtual conference. This would normally be in person, and in person certainly has its own challenges. But what the Nation team pulled off here today, I think is extraordinary, because I think they've done such a great job that what you guys see is, the duck swimming on the surface, and you're not seeing the feet paddling underneath. And that's exactly what should happen. And they've done a great job. And I just want to say thank you to them.